In 1858, a car dealer on the New Orleans to St. Louis run ate the same river stew 3 times a week for 11 years. He never owned land. He never owned a house. His cook was a freed man who built meals from what the river gave him and nothing else. That stew is number 7 on this list. Number 12 kept men sharp enough to deal cards for 16 hours without stopping. And number 3 was so good that first-class passengers bribed the crew to smuggle it upstairs. These 15 meals were never written down. They lived in the hands of cooks who fed hundreds of men on a moving river with no refrigeration and no second chances. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count them down. Number 15. Salt pork and cornbread. This was the baseline. Every steamboat working the Mississippi between St. Louis and New Orleans carried salt pork in the hold because it did not spoil, it did not require refrigeration, and it stretched further than any other cut available to working men on the river. The cook sliced it thin, fried it in its own rendered fat until the edges crisped, and served it alongside a wedge of cornbread made from the coarsest meal in the stores. No seasoning beyond the salt already cured into the pork. No butter. Nothing extra. George Duval, who spent 4 decades gambling on these boats and wrote down what he witnessed, described the crew's provisions as functional, repeated, and entirely separate from anything served in the dining room overhead. The men who steered the boat through the dark water ate this. The passengers above them never knew it existed. Number 14. River catfish stew. The Mississippi produced catfish in quantities that made it impossible to ignore as a daily food source, and river cooks treated it accordingly. They pulled what they needed from the day's catch, cut the fish into sections without ceremony, and dropped everything into a pot of water with whatever was on hand: wild onion, dried pepper, a handful of cornmeal stirred in at the end to thicken the broth. Mark Twain, who traveled this river and paid close attention to how the working men lived, wrote that a fresh catfish pulled straight from the Mississippi had a flavor that no market fish could replicate. The stew was ready in under an hour and required nothing that the river did not already provide for free. Rivermen said you could taste the whole current in a single bowl. Number 13. Hardtack with bacon grease. Hardtack was the bread of men in motion. Baked until it was nearly stone, it resisted mold for months, survived the constant humidity, survived the damp air that rose off the river every morning without fail, and could be carried in a coat pocket with no wrapping. The roustabouts who loaded and unloaded cargo at every landing knew it well. They spread bacon grease across the surface, worked a corner loose with their back teeth, and ate while moving, between tasks, between hands of cards, between ports. No plate, no fork, no table, just a man and a cracker and whatever minutes he had. It was common to the Union Army, to the Merchant Marine, and to every working waterway in 19th century America. The cracker survived the river longer than most of the men who carried it. Number 12. Cold fried chicken. The gamblers who worked the boats for weeks at a stretch needed something they could eat without leaving the table. Cold fried chicken, prepared by the cook before the first hand was dealt and carried to the gaming area wrapped in cloth, was the answer. A man could reach into the bundle, pull a piece, eat it in 4 bites, and return his full attention to his cards before the other players noticed he had moved. It was not about taste. It was not about comfort or the pleasure of a hot meal eaten slowly. George Devil described professional gamblers as men who measured every action by the advantage it produced. A man who ate fast played longer. A man who played longer gave himself more time to recover what he had already lost. This was not a meal. It was arithmetic. Number 11. Pickled eggs in whiskey brine. Before refrigeration reached the boats, preservation meant brine, and on the Mississippi, that meant whiskey cut with salt and vinegar poured over hard-boiled eggs in a sealed glass jar. The jar sat on whatever stable surface was available, sealed against the humidity, and lasted weeks without spoiling. Rivermen reached for them between meals, between ports, between anything that required a pause. The sharpness of the brine cut through fatigue the way nothing warm could. Today, a bar in any American city charges $12 or $14 for a single pickled egg served with a toothpick on a small plate. In the middle of the 19th century, they sat in a jar on every gambling boat working the stretch between Memphis and Baton Rouge, and nobody put a price on them at all. Before we go further, here is something the entertainment industry spent the better part of a century making sure you would never stop to consider. Every film ever made about the Mississippi riverboat gamblers presents the same image. A man in a white linen suit, a gold pocket watch, a glass of bourbon, a table covered in green felt. That is the version Hollywood decided to sell. George Duval, who actually gambled on the Mississippi for 40 years and wrote down what he witnessed, tells a different story. He describes staying alive on a moving river among men who would take everything you had and feel no guilt about it. He describes watching his back at every landing. He describes the daily work of survival. He does not describe fine dining. The food that kept these men functional was not romantic. It was ruthless, and that is exactly why it never made it into the picture. Number 10. Red beans and rice. crew version. In New Orleans, red beans on Monday was not a preference. It was a tradition built around the logic of labor. Wash day fell on Monday, and the beans went into the pot in the morning because they required no active attention. You started them, walked away, and came back to a meal that had cooked itself over slow heat. River cooks carried the same logic onto the boats. A pot of red kidney beans simmered in water with salt pork, stirred when the cook could manage it and left alone when he could not, served over rice that stretched the whole thing further than anything else in the stores. On the upper decks, the captain ate from china. The men who held the wheel through the night and kept the boat off the sandbars ate this. Nobody thought to write that down. Number 9. Dirty rice with river scraps. Dirty rice came from a principle that every Creole cook along the lower Mississippi understood before it had a formal name. Nothing leaves the kitchen. When a chicken was killed for the first-class dining room above, the giblets, liver, gizzard, heart went to the crew cook below. He chopped them small, browned them in a dry pan over the heat from the boiler room, and worked them into cooked rice with whatever aromatics were in the stores. The color of the rice darkened as the scraps cooked through. The smell changed entirely. A handful of discarded organ meat turned an entire pot of plain rice into a meal with genuine substance and weight. Nothing on a working river was wasted. Not a bird, not a bone, not a fistful of yesterday's rice scraped from the bottom of the pot. Number 8. Corn pone with molasses. Cornmeal, water, salt. That was the entire list of ingredients. The cook mixed them until the batter held its shape, formed it into flat rounds with his hands, and cooked the rounds on a dry iron surface until the outside crisped and the center steamed through. Molasses came out of a jug, kept near the cook stove thick, dark, poured over the hot pone until it soaked into the crust and pooled along the bottom of the tin plate. It was the cheapest combination of carbohydrate and sugar available on the river, and it provided enough fuel for a man to work through the night without slowing. The roustabouts who hauled cargo at each landing ate it between shifts. A man who had corn pone and molasses at midnight still had enough left in him to deal cards until the sky over the water turned gray. Number 7. River turtle soup, crew version. Turtle soup appeared on the menus of the finest steamboat dining rooms throughout the middle of the 19th century, served from a tureen, accompanied by sherry, brought to the table by a white-jacketed steward. That version existed above the main deck. Below it, the crew cook made his own from whatever the kitchen above had trimmed away and discarded after preparing the choice cuts for the passengers. He added those scraps to a pot of river water with dried herbs and whatever starchy vegetable was in the stores, and he simmered the whole thing for hours until the connective tissue broke down and the liquid turned deep and dark. The first-class passengers ordered it with sherry at a proper table. The cooks who prepared it for them ate what remained in the pot after service was finished. Number 6. Smoked catfish with wild onion. There was no refrigeration on the boats and no reliable way to keep fresh fish from turning in the river humidity unless you smoked it. The cook built a slow fire from whatever hardwood was available. Pecan was common along the lower river and hung the catfish over the smoke for hours until the moisture was drawn out and the flesh took on a color and a density. That meant it could be held for another day or two without risk. Wild onion grew along both banks of the Mississippi through most of the working year, and a handful of it set briefly against the edge of the same fire until the outer layer charred, cut through the richness of the smoked fish with a sharpness that made the combination something beyond fuel. A cook who understood this skill fed hundreds of men from what the river provided at no cost. His name appears in no record. Pause the countdown for a moment. Modern nutritional science now recognizes that red beans and rice together provide a complete protein. The amino acids in the legume and the grain complement each other in a way that neither provides alone. The cooks who made this combination on the river every Monday did not know the terminology. They knew that men who ate it worked longer and complained less. They knew the pot lasted further, and the crew stayed sharper. The catfish provided high-quality protein and fat in a form the body processes readily. The smoked fish, combined with wild alliums, produced something that, evaluated today, holds its own against expensive whole foods sold in any modern market. These were not people making do with inferior ingredients out of ignorance. They were solving a specific problem: how to keep men functional on a river with no supply line and no margin for failure. They solved it. They just never received the credit. Number 5. Oyster stew. Gulf oysters traveled north on the Mississippi, packed in ice, loaded into the holds of boats coming up from New Orleans. And this is where the class division on the river made itself most visible. The first-class dining room received them in their shells, open to order, served in a stew of cream and butter and black pepper in a deep bowl that a passenger could take his time with at a properly set table. The gamblers and the working crew got the same oysters hauled aboard at the same landing, transported in the same ice, pulled from the same beds in the same Gulf water. But theirs came cold, eaten standing up between card hands or between cargo shifts, without ceremony and without heat. Same river, same beds. Same boat. The passengers ate them in a room that resembled something in a Street Lewis hotel. The gamblers ate them in the dark with their hands. Same oysters. Different world entirely. Number 4. Gumbo. The river cook's version. Gumbo along the lower Mississippi descends from cooking traditions that converged in Louisiana over the course of 2 centuries. West African, French Creole, and Native American methods meeting in a port city where no single culture controlled the kitchen entirely. The version made for river crews bore almost no resemblance to what was served above decks. A river cook's gumbo started with a roux flour and fat cooked together in a heavy pan until the color moved from pale to the deep brown of river mud, and from there it accepted whatever the week had left available. Catfish, salt pork, dried shrimp if the boat had passed through a coastal port recently, whatever vegetable remained in the stores. No 2 pots were the same. The cook did not work from a written recipe because nothing on the river stayed consistent long enough to follow one. He worked from judgment, from smell, from the sound of the roux as the color shifted. A good river cook could make the result taste deliberate when it was built entirely from what remained. Number 3. Ash cake. This was the oldest form of bread made on the American River, and it required nothing except cornmeal, water, salt, and fire. The cook mixed the 3 ingredients until the dough held its shape, pressed it flat with both hands into a round, the thickness of a thumb, and laid it directly into the hot ash at the base of the boiler room fire. He buried it with a tool or with his boot, and he waited. When he pulled it out, he knocked the ash from the surface with the flat of his hand, and what remained was a bread with a crust formed from direct contact with heat and earth, and a center that was still soft enough to tear apart. No pan, no grease, no oven, no waiting for equipment that did not exist on a boat moving through the lower river at night. The men who made it pressed it flat with their hands, buried it in the ash, and waited. When you have nothing, you learn patience. The bread that came out of that fire was the best bread on the river. Number 2. Catfish bone broth. When the catfish was cleaned and the fillets were gone, sent upstairs for the dining room service or smoked for the crew's next meal, what remained was the frame, the spine, the ribs, the head, with its cheeks still attached. Another cook might have discarded it. A river cook kept the fire burning and dropped the whole frame into a pot of water before the bones had time to cool. He let it go overnight. The collagen in the joints dissolved into the water slowly. The fat rendered out from the head. By morning, the liquid had become something between a stock and a broth, rich enough to coat the inside of a tin cup. Concentrated enough to cut through 6 hours of lamp smoke and card game noise and river fatigue. Rivermen did not sit down for a formal breakfast. They poured this into a cup and drank it standing at the rail while the boat moved. Modern restaurants sell versions of this under various names and charge accordingly for the privilege. On the Mississippi, in the years when these boats ran the full length of the river, it was what you drank when you could not stop long enough to eat. Number 1. The end of run meal. This was not a single dish. It was a practice. At the close of every run, when the boat had worked its way from Street, Louis or Cairo down to New Orleans, or from New Orleans back north through the bends and the shallows and the sandbars that could stop a boat dead, if the pilot misjudged the channel, the cook went through what remained: the salt pork that had not been used, the rice at the bottom of the sack, the cold ash cake left from the previous morning, the last of the catfish broth still sitting in the pot. He combined everything into one vessel and cooked it over whatever heat the boiler still gave off as the boat slowed toward the landing. It was different every time. Sometimes it leaned toward a stew. Sometimes it was closer to a thick porridge. It depended entirely on what the week had left behind. And when that pot was ready, every man on the boat ate from it. The captain, the pilot who had kept the wheel through fog and darkness for a week, the card dealers who had spent the entire run maintaining the fiction that they were a different order of men from the crew below decks, the roustabouts, the cook himself. One pot, one ladle, one meal. They did not call it leftovers. They called it the end of run meal. On the Mississippi, for one meal at the close of every journey, there was no rank and no table distinction and no first class. There was only the river and the fire and whatever was left. These 15 meals were never about poverty. They were about precision. The men and women who cooked on the Mississippi had almost nothing to work with, and they wasted none of it. They fed card sharps and coal shovelers and river pilots and freedmen with the same water, the same fire, and knowledge passed from hand to hand because there was no other way to carry it forward. None of this appears in the histories of the American frontier that got written and rewritten across the 20th century. What gets remembered is the green felt table and the man in the white suit. What gets forgotten is the cook below decks who made it possible for that man to sit at that table for 16 hours without stopping. Here is the challenge. Pick one meal from this list, not the most complicated one, the simplest one you can manage with what is already in your kitchen. Cook it this week, not from a restaurant, not from a delivery app, not from a shortcut. At your own stove, with cheap ingredients, with patience, sit at a table when it is ready, and eat it slow. Then come down to the comments and tell me what you made and what it tasted like. Tell me if it reminded you of anything your grandmother put on the table when you were young. Tell me if it surprised you. Because this food does not belong to any restaurant, or any cookbook, or any history that decided it was not worth including. It belongs to whoever is willing to remember it. The Mississippi is still there. The river does not forget, even when we do.